Welcome to the Futuristic Adventures story. Here you find the best HFY story written by human. Listen the story. If you like it, subscribe the channel.
I woke up in an alien lab and their queen just declared me her mate. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. A sharp metallic scent filled Ryan Carter's nostrils as he stirred awake, his head pounding like he had taken a hammer to the skull. His body felt unnaturally heavy, the pressure against his wrists and ankles confirming what his groggy mind couldn't yet process. He was strapped down. The cold touch of steel against his back sent a chill rippling through him, and as his vision adjusted, the sterile blue glow of overhead lights sharpened into focus. He wasn't in his ship. He wasn't anywhere human. He sucked in a breath, trying to move, but his restraints refused to budge. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind, but years of surviving in the void had trained him to think before he let fear take over. His eyes darted around, scanning the room. Everything about the place screamed alien. The walls weren't metal, at least not any kind he recognized. They pulsed faintly, almost organic, like the ship itself was breathing. Strange floating instruments hovered in midair, shifting and twisting like they were alive, responding to his movement. The air was thin, artificial, carrying a faintly sweet scent that didn't belong to any station or planet he had ever set foot on. The last thing he remembered was being on a routine supply run near the outer colonies. A distressed beacon had drawn him in, classic setup for an ambush. And yet he answered anyway, a mistake one. He might not walk away from his breathing, steadied, forcing his mind into focus. He'd been captured, but by who, and more importantly, for what purpose? A shadow shifted at the edge of his vision, and he turned his head just as a figure emerged from the dimly lit entryway. The moment he saw her, his breath hitched in his throat. She was unlike anything he had ever seen, and in all his years navigating the stars he had seen a lot. Her skin gleamed like liquid silver, catching the sterile light and reflecting it in a way that made her appear otherworldly, ethereal. 6 eyes, a mesmerizing shade of emerald green, studied him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Her features were sharp, symmetrical, regal in a way that sent a clear message. This was someone powerful, someone used to command, draped in intricate fabric woven with symbols that his brain couldn't yet decipher. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her long, ornate tail curling behind her in a way that was almost hypnotic. Ryan stiffened as she approached, instinct screaming at him to prepare for the worst. He had no idea what species she belonged to, but if they had gone through the trouble of capturing him, they weren't planning on letting him go. He kept his expression unreadable, masking the flicker of unease racing beneath his skin. You are awake. Her voice was smooth, deliberate, but there was something else in it, something heavier. Expectation. Ryan swallowed down the biting remark that almost slipped free. Pissing off his captor wasn't going to get him anywhere. Instead, he took a slow breath, pushing down the rising frustration that burned in his chest. Yeah, I figured that part out, he muttered, testing the restraints again. No give. They weren't taking any chances now. Mind telling me where the hell I am? Her gaze didn't waver. You are aboard the Star Imperial vessel within the heart of the royal capital. She tilted her head slightly as if observing his reaction. Waiting for something. You were not harmed. Ryan let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Yeah, and I should be grateful for that. His patience was running thin. Why am I here for the first time? Her expression shifted, something unreadable flickering across her features. You have been selected. The words hung between them, sharp-weighted, but they made no damn sense. Ryan narrowed his eyes, jaw clenching. Selected for what? A new presence entered the room before she could answer. Another Starks, this one older, dressed in robes that looked even more ornate than hers. The newcomer regarded Ryan with a mixture of intrigue and scrutiny before speaking in the same calm, measured tone. You are the perfect genetic match. Ryan's pulse kicked up. He had heard some wild things in his time, but that was new. The perfect match for what? The queen, because that was the only thing she could be. Standing with that level of authority, took a step closer, and for the first time something resembling hesitance flickered in those impossible green eyes. To be my mate? Ryan froze, brain slamming to a halt. Of all the things he had expected, that sure as hell hadn't been one of them. He barked out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. I'm sorry, I must have hit my head harder than I thought. Did you just say make the older Starks? Clearly some kind of advisor nodded as if this was the most logical thing in the universe. Your genetic composition has been analyzed and confirmed among all species examined. You alone possess the necessary compatibility to sustain and strengthen the royal lineage. The Queen has chosen to proceed. Ryan's stomach twisted. This was insane. He had been abducted, strapped down, and now they were telling him he was supposed to be some kind of breeding partner. Yeah, I'm going to have to decline that offer. He pulled at his restraints again, harder this time. Not exactly my idea of a dream job. The Queen's expression remained unreadable. But something shifted in the room, an unspoken tension thickening the air. This is not a request, she said, voice still, calm but carrying an undeniable weight. The survival of my people depends on it. Ryan locked eyes with her, searching for some kind of weakness, some way out of this. Then I guess your people are screwed because I'm not interested. For a long moment she didn't respond. Then to his surprise she exhaled slowly, as if she had expected this reaction. I did not anticipate compliance, she admitted, her tail curling behind her. But I will not force what cannot be given willingly. Ryan didn't trust that for a second. He had been around enough power plays to know when someone was maneuvering for control. If she wasn't going to force him, then she was going to find another way to break him. He needed to figure out how to get out of this, and fast. The Queen studied him a moment longer before turning to the advisor. Release him from the restraints. Ensure he is treated as a guest. The advisor hesitated. My Queen, I have made my decision. Reluctantly, the restraints unlocked with a soft hiss, and Ryan barely waited for them to fully disengage before sit up, rubbing his sore wrists. He was free, but he knew better than to assume that meant he was safe. As he met the Queen's gaze again, one thing became painfully clear. This was just the beginning, and whatever game she was playing, he had just become a key piece on the board. Ryan rolled his shoulders the second the restraints fully released, forcing himself to remain steady even as every instinct screamed at him to fight his way out. He had been in tight spots before, but this was a whole new level of trouble. Being stranded on some backwater colony with raiders breathing down his neck was one thing. Being trapped in the heart of an alien empire that thought he was some kind of royal breeding stock with something else entirely. His mind raced with possible escape routes, but nothing looked good. He was on a massive ship, probably light years away from any known system, and even if he somehow got off this floating palace, where the hell would he go? There were no allies here, no familiar faces, just a coldly calculating Queen and an empire that had already decided his fate. The guards in the room shifted, clearly uneasy with the Queen's command, but none of them dared question her. That told him a lot. She had absolute authority, but it wasn't unquestioned. There were limits to her power, and he needed to find them fast. The moment he was fully upright, he took stock of the situation. The Queen, Ain, as they had called her, stood watching him with a patience that was almost unnerving. The advisor at her side still looked like he was tasting something sour, clearly disapproving of this entire situation. Ryan had no idea what kind of internal politics were at play, but he knew one thing: he wasn't about to roll over and accept whatever fate they had planned for him. Ain finally spoke, her voice measured, but carrying the same weight of expectation. You will be taken to your quarters. You are not a prisoner, but you are not free to leave the palace. She just gestured slightly, and a pair of guards stepped forward, but they didn't move to restrain him. That was interesting. They were giving him the illusion of freedom, trying to make him feel like he had a choice in all this. Smart, manipulative. He hated how well it was working. Ryan exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. Right, guessed. Because kidnapping someone and telling them they're supposed to be a royal babymaker really screams hospitality. He expected a reaction, some sign of offense, but Ain remained composed. Either she had nerves of steel or she had expected his defiance. And what happens if I refuse to play along? You just going to keep me locked up until I change my mind? Ain tilted her head slightly, those 6 emerald eyes narrowing just enough to make it clear she was considering her words carefully. I do not intend to force what cannot be given, but the reality of your position remains. You are more than a guest, you are a necessity. She stepped closer, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made his skin itch. You misunderstand. If you think this is only about bloodlines, your presence here shifts more than you realize. Ryan held her stare, refusing to be the first to look away. He had dealt with powerful people before, but none quite like her. There was something beneath the surface of her words, something unspoken but heavy. He wasn't sure if she was warning him or testing him. Either way, he wasn't about to let her control the conversation. Yeah, well, forgive me if I'm not thrilled about being turned into a political pawn. A ghost of a smile flickered across her lips, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Then perhaps we share more common ground than you think. Before he could press her further, the guard stepped in, motioning for him to follow. He hesitated, debating whether or not to make a run for it, but quickly dismissed the idea. Even if he managed to get past them, where would he go? No, for now he had to play along, gather information, and wait for the right opportunity. He had survived worse. He could survive this. The halls of the palace were as alien as everything else about this place. The architecture was sleek, curved, and impossibly vast, with ceilings so high they felt more like open skies than enclosed spaces. Strange symbols adorned the walls, pooling with faint energy, as if the ship itself was alive. Stars, nobles moved through the corridors, their silver skin and glowing garments making them look like something out of myth. Some watched him with curiosity, others with clear disdain. He didn't need to understand their language to know that not everyone approved of his presence here. That could be a problem or an advantage, depending on how he played it. Eventually they reached his quarters, and Ryan braced himself for a cell. Instead, the door slid open to reveal something that looked more like a luxury suite than a prison. A massive chamber stretched out before him, with intricate furniture that seemed to shift, subtly adjusting to some unseen command. The walls were lined with tall open archways that overlooked a sprawling alien skyline, floating platforms, shimmering towers, and a vast sea of stars beyond. It was beautiful in an almost unsettling way. This wasn't just some military vessel. This was a throne in the heart of an empire. One of the guards stepped forward, speaking in a clipped, formal tone. Food and clothing have been prepared. You will remain here unless summoned. Ryan arched a brow. Some, and for what exactly? The guard didn't answer, merely inclining his head before stepping back. The doors slid shut behind them, and Ryan exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he turned to take in his new home. He wasn't naive enough to believe he wasn't being watched. There were no visible cameras, but he could feel it, eyes on him, studying, waiting. He needed to figure out what they wanted from him, really wanted, not just the nonsense about genetics, and he needed to find a way to turn this situation in his favor. The first thing he did was check the exits. The main door was locked. No surprise there. The archways led to an open balcony, but there was no visible way down. He was high up, probably near the top of the palace. Jumping was out of the question, unless he suddenly developed the ability to fly. He ran a hand along the walls, searching for hidden panels, but if there were any, they weren't obvious. With a sigh, he turned back to the center of the room, where a table had been set with food. The dishes were unfamiliar, but he could smell the rich spices, the subtle tang of something citrusy. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since hell. He didn't even know how long he had been unconscious. He wasn't stupid. The food could be drugged, laced with something to make him more compliant. But if they had wanted to sedate him, they could have done it already. He sat down, picking up one of the strange fruits, testing its weight before taking a cautious bite. Sweet with an odd but pleasant aftertaste, he ate slowly, forcing himself to think instead of letting exhaustion take over. He had time. He wasn't in immediate danger, not yet. But that could change fast. As he finished eating, the door suddenly hissed open again, and he tensed. Anne stepped inside, alone this time, her presence filling the room with a quiet authority. She studied him for a moment before speaking. You do not trust me? Ryan leaned back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. You abducted me, strapped me to a table, and told me I was supposed to be your mate. What gave it away? She didn't react, simply regarding him with those unreadable emerald eyes. Then I will ask you a question, human. If I were to offer you a way out, true freedom, what would you be willing to trade for it? Ryan narrowed his eyes, every muscle in his body going still. There, it was the real game, and whatever answer he gave her, he knew it was about to change everything. Ryan leaned forward slightly, his instincts on high alert, as he studied Alan's expression. That question wasn't idle, and he knew better than to answer too quickly every negotiation he'd ever been in, whether it was bartering for supplies or talking his way out of a hostile situation, had taught him one thing: when someone in power offered you a deal, it was never free. She stood poised, waiting for his response, her 6-emerald eyes calm, unreadable, but something in her tone told him she wasn't just testing him. There was weight behind this moment, a shift in whatever game they were playing, and he couldn't afford to misstep. He exhaled slowly, dragging a hand through his hair, buying himself a few extra seconds freedom. His voice was casual, but his mind was racing. That's a hell of an offer, coming from the person who put me in a cage. Her tail curled slightly behind her, the metal rings adorning it catching the low light of the room. She didn't so much as flinch at his words, but there was something else there, a flicker of something behind her composed mask. Not quite irritation, not amusement either. Something else. You misunderstand, she said finally. Your presence here was not meant to be a punishment, nor was it an accident. Ryan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. Yes, see, that's where we're going to have to disagree. You had me drugged, strapped to a table, and declared me the universe's luckiest genetic lottery winner. I didn't exactly volunteer here for this. He watched her carefully, looking for any sign of reaction, but she remained steady, unreadable. That unnerved him more than he wanted to admit. He was good at reading people, at picking apart their intentions, but she was a different puzzle entirely. She stepped closer, and despite himself, Ryan didn't move. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him shift, wouldn't let her think for even a second that she had the upper hand. But as she drew near, he became acutely aware of just how alien she truly was. Not just her skin or her eyes, but the way she moved, deliberate and controlled, as if every step was a calculation. What do you think freedom means, Ryan Carter? He frowned at the question. Not being locked in this floating palace, not being used as some kind of... He cut himself off, exhaling sharply. Freedom means having a choice. Anne regarded him for a long moment before she spoke again, then make one that threw him off. He had expected another game, another careful maneuver, but this felt different. What exactly are you offering? He asked, voice guarded. She clasped her hands behind her back, shoulders straight, radiating the kind of authority that told him she was used to being listened to. A deal. If you wish to leave, I will allow it. No tricks, no restraints. You will be given a ship and passage to neutral territory. Ryan narrowed his eyes. This was too easy, and in exchange her gaze didn't waver. You will give me 3 days. He blinked. 3 days for what? To understand, she said simply. To see, to learn what this empire is, what it is becoming, and why you mattered. He barked out another laugh, though this one held no real amusement. And then what? You expect me to suddenly change my mind, decide I actually want to be your mate? Alan's lips parted slightly as if she had been about to answer, but then she hesitated. That alone was revelation. She wasn't infallible, wasn't as invincible as she projected. I expect you to choose, she said finally, with full knowledge of what you are refusing. Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand over his jaw. Everything in him screamed that this was a trap, that there had to be a catch, but at the same time, he didn't have a better option if she was telling the truth, and that was a big if. Then he had a chance to gather information, to understand the landscape before making his next move. 3 days wasn't much, but it was something. He looked back at her, holding her gaze, feeling that same charged energy crackling between them. Fine, he said, after a long moment. 3 days, but after that, I walk. Anne inclined her head, satisfaction flickering across her expression. Very well. The moment stretched between them, something unspoken lingering in the air. Then with the same smooth grace, she turned and exited, leaving Ryan standing there with a gut feeling that he had just stepped onto a board far bigger than he realized. The next morning, he was summoned before the High Council. Ryan expected hostility, but the sheer weight of the scrutiny that greeted him when he entered the chamber still took him off guard. The council chamber was vast, built of dark, smooth stone that shimmered faintly under the blue glow of suspended orbs. Overhead, Anne sat at the head of the long curved table, her expression unreadable. As she observed the proceedings, the council members, a mixture of nobles, advisors, and military officials, were already waiting, their eyes sharp and unwelcoming. Human. The voice came from a tall, silver-skinned male seated closest to Alan. His attire was more militarized than the others, with a thick sash of deep violet draped over one shoulder. marking him as someone of high rank. You have been given more consideration than you deserve. Ryan didn't miss the way. Alan's gaze flicked to the man, though she said nothing that was interesting. Yeah, well, forgive me if I don't exactly feel honored. A murmur rippled through the chamber, a mix of disapproval and curiosity. The military noble's eyes darkened, but Ian finally spoke before the tension could escalate. Ryan Carter has agreed to remain for 3 days to better understand his position. And then what? Another noble scoffed. A female with dark silver skin and a cascade of metallic jewelry woven into her long braids. He refuses, and we are left without a solution to our genetic crisis. Ryan frowned. Genetic crisis? That was new information. Ian had mentioned compatibility, but she hadn't elaborated. He glanced at her, but she didn't react. I do not need to remind the council that the survival of our lineage is paramount. Ian continued, voice smooth but firm. But neither will I force a choice that cannot be accepted willingly. The male noble, the military officer, let out a sharp breath. This is folly. We should take what we need. Ryan tensed. Alan's gaze flicked to the man, and for the first time a trace of warning entered her voice. We are not Terrence. The words held a dangerous weight, one that silenced any further protest. But Ryan had heard enough. He might not know the full picture yet, but one thing was clear. He was standing in the middle of a political war, and whether he liked it or not, he was now a piece in the game, and he was running out of time to figure out how to play it. Ryan sat back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes scanning the gathered council as they murmured amongst themselves. The weight of their gazes pressed against him like a physical force, but he refused to let it rattle him. He had been in tight situations before, outnumbered, outgunned, staring down the barrel of some mercenary's rifle. But this was different. This wasn't a fight he could punch or shoot his way out of. It was politics layered with expectation, and the unsettling knowledge that every person in this room wanted something from him. Ian remained silent, allowing the tension to simmer, though he could feel her watching him, waiting to see how he would react. The council wasn't just discussing him like some diplomatic asset. They were debating his ownership as if he were some rare commodity to be bartered and negotiated over. And that military noble, the one who had practically suggested they should take what they needed by force, hadn't even tried to hide his disdain. That was the real danger here. Some of these people didn't care about negotiations or free will. If they decided he was too much trouble, they'd find a way to cut him out of the equation altogether. He needed to start playing his own game before they decided to play theirs. So he said, voice steady as he leaned forward slightly, fixing his gaze on the military officer. Since we're all being real open about things here, why don't you explain exactly why my genetics are so special? You keep talking about survival, about me being the perfect match, but no one's given me a straight answer. He let his words hang in the air for a moment, challenging them. I don't make decisions blind, and I sure as hell don't sign up for something I don't understand. The officer VOs, if Ryan had caught the name correctly, stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line, as if he didn't like being questioned. You do not need to understand, you need only to obey. Ryan smirked, shaking his head. Yeah, see, that's not really my style. Another murmur rippled through the room, some council members exchanging unreadable glances. Ian didn't intervene, which meant she was letting this play out, seeing how he handled himself. Good. That gave him an opening. The stars' lineage, his failing. The voice came from the female noble, the one with the metallic braids, her expression sharp and assessing. For generations our bloodline has weakened. Traditional methods of ensuring genetic stability have proven insufficient. Without intervention, our empire will fracture. Ryan frowned. It sounded less like a political problem and more like a biological one. You're telling me your people are dying out? Ian finally spoke, her voice controlled, but carrying an edge of something deeper. Not dying, but deteriorating. We have reached the limits of our genetic structure. Without new viable integration, our future is uncertain. Ryan exhaled, processing that he wasn't a scientist, but he understood enough to get the implications. The stars had bred within their own line for too long, and now their biology was breaking down. They needed fresh blood, and somehow out of every species in the universe, his was the answer that raised more questions than answers. Let's say I buy that he said, keeping his tone neutral. What makes me so special, humans aren't exactly known for having magic genes. The advisor standing near Ayn Riven, if he remembered correctly, adjusted his robe, stepping forward with the measured patience of someone explaining something to a child. Your species and ours share a distant ancestral link. It is not common knowledge, nor is it widely accepted among our people, but our research confirms it. You are not the first human brought here for evaluation, but you are the first to meet the necessary criteria for royal compatibility. Ryan stared at him, trying to decide whether he was more disturbed by the fact that humans and Star apparently shared some lost genetic history, or the casual way they had just admitted to abducting people for experiments. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. So you've been snatching humans? For how long exactly? V's expression darkened. That is not your concern, Ryan scoffed. I think it is my concern. If you expect me to consider anything you're offering, I need to know exactly what I'm walking into. Ayn tilted her head slightly, observing him. Then you shall have your answers. The tension in the room shifted. The council members didn't look thrilled, but none of them challenged her decision. That told him two things. One, Alan's authority wasn't absolute, and two, she was making a deliberate choice to give him information they probably didn't want him to have. That was interesting. She rose from her seat with the same controlled grace she always carried, and Ryan felt the shift in the air as the council took her movement as a silent command. This discussion is concluded for now, she said, her tone brooking no argument. Ryan Carter will be granted access to the Royal Archives under my supervision. Vo stiffened. My queen, my decision is final, she cut in smoothly, her voice like tempered steel. Ryan fought the urge to smirk. He didn't trust Ayn, not yet, but at least she seemed willing to give him something. The council dispersed, though not without lingering looks of displeasure. Vos was the last to leave, his gaze lingering on Ryan for a moment too long, something dangerous simmering beneath his cold expression. Ryan met his stare head on, refusing to back down. Once they were alone, Ayn exhaled, turning to face him fully. You have a talent for making enemies. Ryan huffed a quiet laugh. Yeah, it's a gift. She studied him for a moment before gesturing for him to follow. Come. You want the truth? I will show you. Ryan hesitated, then nodded, falling into step beside her as they left the council chamber. As they walked, the palace stretched out around them, its vast corridors lined with shimmering panels that flickered with information. As they passed, the structure wasn't just a ship. It was alive, pooling with an energy that hummed beneath Ryan's skin. Whatever technology the Starks had, it was centuries beyond anything humanity had developed. Ayn led him through a set of sealed doors, entering a chamber that felt older than the rest of the palace. The moment they stepped inside, the air changed, thicker, charged with something ancient. The walls were lined with crystalline structures, each one glowing with fragments of stored data. This, Ayn said, stepping forward, is the true history of our people. Ryan's pulse kicked up as the crystals flickered to life, images and recordings appearing in the air before him. The first thing he saw made his breath hitch. Humans, not just recent ones, ancient ones, recorded in the same way the stars were, as if they had once been part of the same civilization. Ayn turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Now you understand. Ryan clenched his jaw. He didn't understand, not yet, but he had the sinking feeling that whatever this was, it was bigger than just him, bigger than Ayn, bigger than the entire empire. And if he wasn't careful, he was about to get caught in the middle of something far beyond his control. Ryan's stomach coiled into a knot as the holographic images flickered before him, ancient records unfolding in a quiet, mesmerizing display. The humans he saw weren't just random figures plucked from history. They were entwined with the Starks, standing beside them, speaking with them, living among them as equals. Some wore what looked like ceremonial robes, others appeared to be engaged in technological developments he couldn't even begin to understand. It wasn't just some vague genetic connection. Humans and Starks had coexisted once, and for some reason that fact had been buried. His eyes flicked toward Ayn, who stood beside him, her posture composed, but her gaze unreadable. He wasn't sure what he expected: an explanation, an apology, maybe even some acknowledgement that this was a hell of a thing to drop on him. But she simply watched, waiting to see his reaction. Ryan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "You're telling me humanity was part of this empire?" His voice came out, rougher than he intended, the weight of the revelation hitting him harder than expected. "That we didn't just show up in the stars one day and start stumbling around like idiots. We had a place here." Anne inclined her head slightly, her silver skin catching the glow of the holograms. "Not just a place, a purpose. The Starks and your kind were once bonded through an alliance that shaped the foundation of what my people became. Our genetic structures were never meant to remain separate. That separation was forced." Ryan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Forced? That meant someone, either human or Starks, had deliberately cut ties between the two species." He wasn't a historian, but he knew what that kind of erasure meant. Someone had decided that humanity wasn't meant to know about its connection to the Starks, and they had done everything in their power to make sure the truth never resurfaced. His throat felt tight as he turned back to the glowing records, scanning through them, looking for some kind of answer that would make this all make sense. "Why hide it?" he asked, voice low. "If we were allies, if we were supposed to be connected, why erase all of it? Why pretend we were never here?" Anne was silent for a long moment before stepping closer, her presence steady, unmoving. "Because it was easier to control us when we were separate." Ryan frowned, glancing at her. "Control you?" She nodded, gesturing toward another set of projections that flared to life in response to her command. These were different from the earlier records, less peaceful, more fractured. Ryan watched as wars played out in flickering light, battles waged between Stark's factions, between species, between ideologies that had splintered over time. There were those who believed our bond with humanity was a weakness. Alan continued, her tone measured but carrying an edge of something colder, that we had deluded ourselves by sharing knowledge, by merging our genetics, by forging alliances that threatened the pure sovereignty of the Stark's empire. Ryan exhaled sharply. "Let me guess. The ones who didn't agree ended up wiped out." Alan's gaze remained steady. "History is written by those who survive." Ryan shook his head, a bitter taste in his mouth. He had seen enough power struggles, enough colonial expansion, enough imperialist greed to recognize what had happened. The stars had purged their own history. They had erased their connection to humanity to keep themselves in control, and now, generations later, it was coming back to bite them. "That's why you need me," he said, the realization settling in. "It's not just about compatibility or trying to restore something that was taken." Alan's expression didn't shift, but he could see the way her hands tightened at her sides. "Our empire is fracturing. The council clings to old traditions that no longer serve us. They believe in power through isolation, through purity of bloodline. But the truth is, we were never meant to be isolated. We thrived when we were together." Ryan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. This was bigger than he had imagined. He wasn't just some genetic match for a queen desperate to save her people. He was a piece of a puzzle that had been missing for centuries, and now that puzzle was being put back together, whether the Starks wanted it or not. He looked back at Anne, something unreadable passing between them. "You think bonding with me is going to fix all of this?" She studied him, her 6 emerald eyes searching his face for something he wasn't sure he even had. "I think it is the first step, and I think you know that too." Ryan let out a slow breath. He hated that she wasn't wrong. The next few hours passed in a blur of information, of history being rewritten in front of him. Anne walked him through more of the archives, showing him evidence of things he could barely wrap his head around: maps of trade routes that had once linked Earth to Stark's world, ancient treaties written in a language that looked both familiar and completely foreign, records of human scientists working alongside their alien counterparts centuries before humanity had even officially launched into deep space. Every piece of it chipped away the foundation of what he thought he knew. By the time they left the archive chamber, his head was pounding, but there was no time to process any of it the moment they stepped back into the main halls of the palace. They were intercepted by 2 guards. "My queen," one of them said, bowing his head respectfully before turning his gaze toward Ryan. "You are needed at the evening ceremony." Ryan frowned. "Ceremony?" Anne barely glanced at him before nodding to the guards. "Understood." Ryan crossed his arms, resisting the urge to sigh. "You going to explain, or am I supposed to just go with it?" Anne finally looked at him, her Expression unreadable tonight. The nobles will expect you to be presented as my chosen consort. If I do not formally acknowledge your presence, it will be seen as